So welcome everyone to the School of Business's first Thought Leader webinar of the fall 2025 semester. So today we'll be having a presentation from Dr. Adam Wood. Adam Wood earned a PhD in management with a specialization in organizational behavior from the University of Southern California, an MA in psychology from the University of Colorado, and a BA in history from the University of Chicago. His research interests are focused in the areas of interpersonal perception, leadership, negotiation, and decision-making, especially as they impact organizational dynamics and culture. Using multi-method designs, this line of work examines individual, dyadic, and group determinants of emotion regulation and recognition. In addition to his global consulting experience in leadership development training, Dr. Wood has several years of prior industry experience as a management and technology consultant in both the United States and Europe with Visa, Sybase, Federal Express, and American Management Systems. He is a published author and has presented at numerous academic conferences, including the Academy of Management and American Psychological Association. He is a member of the Academy of Management, American Psychological Society, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. Dr. Wood is a professor of management and the assessment officer for the Woodbury University School of Business. I now give the floor to Dr. Wood.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I appreciate it. Actually, we're not going to be talking about any of those things today, but hopefully it will still be interesting. So I'm actually going to talk about a topic which touches all of those areas and maybe all of the areas that you either live or work in, and that is dealing with data and deciding how to make decisions from that data. So we're living in certainly an age with a lot of data. And so I thought about different ways of naming this. And well, I'll get to some of the names of this that could have been used for this presentation, but I wanted to keep it positive. So I wanted to look at how we can find data that we trust, and how can we use that data in our daily decision making or in your research projects. I will have to say that this project started from an idea and a conversation with my daughter over chocolate chip cookies. So a few weeks ago, she told me that, well, she loves to bake and she loves to bake chocolate chip cookies. She would no longer be baking any chocolate chip cookies. And I asked her why. And she said, well, because the price of chocolate chip cookies has gone up to $49 a bag just for a small bag of chocolate chip cookies. And I thought, whoa, that's weird. I thought that seems, I know there's inflation. I know things are expensive, but $49 for a small bag of chocolate chip cookies seemed, a small bag of chocolate chips seemed a little bit crazy. And I asked her, well, what makes you think that? Where did you get that information? And she said, from TikTok, right? And so I thought, that doesn't seem right. Maybe I should go find out how much chocolate chip cookies actually cost. So it took me about 4 seconds to go to Costco and Google chocolate chip cookies, and it came back with $16.99 for a bag, a 4.5-pound bag of chocolate chips, which is a lot of chocolate chips, right? And I thought, well, that is weird because it was very easy to verify that, and yet she just believed it, right? Because it was online, somebody very, authoritarian was talking, or authoritative. And I guess, that is sort of where people are getting their information from now. And I thought to myself, wow, this could be a real problem because she's smart, and she seemed to sort of take it without questioning it at all. There was another, I had a similar situation. You might have heard this recently. This was also all over TikTok, that if you wear a weighted vest, you're going to have much better results from your workouts. And in fact, one promoter on TikTok said the benefits to walking with a weighted vest are insane. Your posture, your bones, increased calorie burn, your strength, your endurance. I could go on and on and on. And I thought to myself, I wonder if that's true. So I did a little bit of research and found out not true, right? So the evidence just does not exist. It could be true, but the one study that we can even cite that looked at this found that people Comparing people who walked with weighted vests to those who did not walk with weighted vests found no significant difference in bone health. Research does not support these claims that weighted vests improve muscle and bone strength, right? Those are two very different realities, right? And we seem to be struggling at a time in humanity where information is out of control or being challenged. I sort of thought about what age are we currently in. I know from your lessons in history, I'm sure you all learned about the different eras, ages, Bronze Age, Iron Age, the Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, going to the Information Age. And I thought, well, what age comes after the Information Age? And I decided that it's the Misinformation Age or the Disinformation Age. If you're wondering, what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation? Basically, it's just the intent behind it, right? Misinformation is just maybe I accidentally published something or accidentally, put something out there and made an honest mistake, right? And somebody picked that up. Disinformation, the intent could actually be nefarious, or you could be trying to mislead people. And either way, it's tough to tell, right? The scarier thing is that when we look at where people are getting their information, a lot of it is from TikToks. So 17% of US adults regularly get their news from TikTok. And younger people tend to get even more news from TikTok. So almost 40% of adults age 18 to 29 get news from TikTok. I imagine below 18, it's even higher, right? And this has been an exponential increase in getting information from TikTok. And there is a price to pay for this, right? This was a study from out of Australia that looked at basically how much information people are getting from TikTok. They reported that the average time a user spends on TikTok is 34 hours per month. In the United States, 63% of users are teens, and 58% of them access the platform regularly. 40% of Gen Z in the US now use TikTok for searching the internet, yet top results often contain misinformation, right? So I thought I would use my Thought Leader webinar to talk about where do we get our information from and how can we learn to trust information, because being in the age of misinformation is probably a bad thing. And in fact, it's so bad that some countries are even banning TikTok because basically, some of it is just propaganda. It promotes hate speech. It can be manipulative content, causes harm to children. And unfortunately, the mode of presentation on TikTok, this video mode, seems to carry more weight, especially in the eyes of younger people, right? For some reason, somebody saying something is more authoritative and more believable than just reading it on a piece of paper, even though I don't think it's particularly more difficult to do. So I thought about who might be here today, and I think we're all consumers of information. It's impossible not to be, and information is a good thing. That's why I wanted to sort of frame this as a positive inquiry today. And of course, I'll also present some data for researchers if you're conducting any research or if you're just curious about what is going on and how to get to actual sources of trustworthy data. A couple of sort of thoughts I had about how powerful information is came from watching this show Severance. Has anybody watched this? Highly recommend it. It's very good. Luckily, I was late to watch this, so I'm like binge watching right now. I'm right in the middle of season 2. And I was watching it and I thought about one of the actors in the show who I knew I had seen before, but I could not remember his name. And so I thought, okay, well, I mean, I guess I could go to IMDb and look up the list of actors. But if it was a lesser known character, they might not even appear, or it might be harder to find. This guy happens to be pretty well known, but I just couldn't think of his name. But I did remember that he was also in The Big Lebowski, if any of you are fans. And I realized there's a really easy way to get to how to find an actor besides just searching through a database like IMDb is if you can just have 2 points of data, you can get your answer almost immediately, right? So if you just go into a Google search, I'm gonna try not to switch back and forth because it becomes a little more difficult during a presentation. But if you just pull up an internet browser and you type in Severance and The Big Lebowski, the actor who I'm talking about should be one of your top results. Usually it's your top 1 or 2, 3 results, right? And in this case, it was John Turturro, and that came up immediately, right? So we went from, okay, one random person in this show, which I couldn't think of their name. All I had to do was think of another show that he was in, and all of a sudden we get the answer, right? So literally just by cross-referencing 2 pieces of data, that first result in Google in a search engine is the actor's name. By the way, you can also reverse this, right? If you're trying to think of the name of a movie and you know of 2 actors that are in the movie, of course, one actor is not going to help you that much. You'd have to go through his or her whole resume of movies. But if you remember 2 actors, you just put in these 2 actors' names, in this case, Mark Wahlberg, John Goodman, and you get The Gambler, right? So literally just by adding one more piece of data, because of the power of cross-referencing, you get the answer, right? By the way, this is also a technique that police use. So we'll talk about how to avoid getting caught committing a crime here in a second. And they also use the power of cross-referencing. I'll give you one other example. Say you know somebody who lives on Main Street in the US. That could be quite difficult to find that person, right? Anybody know how many Main Streets there are in the US? You want to guess? Thousands.
I was going to say thousands. Yeah.
Yep. It's one of the most common names in the US. So 7,644.
Wow.
And, I spent the whole weekend counting them all. Actually, no, I use the program. There is a really amazing program for those of you who are interested in mapping or GIS or anything like that, called TurboOverpass.eu, which is a programmable map. And you can basically just ask it, any questions like how many streets are named Main Street in the US, and it will give you the answer. I don't know if ChatGPT can do that, but there's a lot more stuff you can do with this. And in fact, so if you knew that this person lived on Main Street, it'd be very difficult to find them, right? But if you had one cross street, right? So say the cross street is Independence Parkway in this. I just picked a random example. So there happens to be 346. Those 2 cross streets intersect exactly 4 times in the United States, right? And so we went from a huge number of possibilities, but if you combine it with even another very large number of possibilities, you quickly get down to 4 possibilities. And if you were a police officer, it'd be very easy to go visit those 4 areas, right? Versus 7,000 areas. By the way, it's also, now that we live in the era of cell phones, if you carry your cell phone with you, it's incredibly easy for the police to find you, even if they don't know who you are, right? So let's say that you wanted to find out who this person was. You do not know who they are, but let's say that you knew that this is a video grab from LAX, right? So you don't know who they are. You don't even know what they look like. But if they have a phone and that they were at LAX, well, then you have some possibility of finding them, right? But still in the thousands of people, right? So let's say, I'm not even sure how many people pass through LAX every day, tens of thousands, I would guess, if not more, right? So that would be a very large list of people you're going through. And in fact, you don't even know what to look for, right? You don't know their name. You don't know what their face is. So you're looking just at a list of, okay, people's names that, somehow are carrying a cell phone, right? However, using cross-referencing, and this is exactly what the police do, if you know that person was spotted somewhere else also, say somebody wearing the same hoodie, right, was spotted, say, at the Coliseum, right? With those 2 pieces of data, the chance that 2 people carrying the same cell phone number showed up at those two separate places in any given period of time is incredibly small, right? So it goes back to that intersection example of, you go from thousands in two locations, but you cross-reference them, and you can very quickly come up with a very small set of phone numbers where those two people might actually have been, right? By the way, they used to call this cross-referencing in police detective work. They now call it link analysis. This is how they find the people that they want to find, right? And you can do this with video grabs. You can do it with cell phones. You can do it with car spottings, right? Basically, if you have two sets of data, it becomes much easier to find people. By the way, the statistical or mathematical analysis to do this is just a Venn diagram, right? It's basically just two sets of data that intersect, right? And you're just looking for anything that's in common. And in fact, if you increase the data set from 2 to 3, then the probability becomes much more likely that you can find that person quickly, even if you don't know who they are, what they look like, just the fact that they're carrying the same phone in two separate locations. So that's my argument for the power of data. Because I was a history major, I always like to talk about sort of some of the influences of history, and in this case, the influence of data and the use of data in management, particularly. Of course, management has existed since people have been in groups, right? Chinese, the Greeks, the Romans all had basic management functions. But it wasn't really until the sort of much more recently that we started to use data in systematic ways. So before it was much more trial and error. But the introduction of systematic management basically started to measure things, right? And so some of the first measurements in management were the time and movement studies, right? Where you looked at how much time does it take to do something. And the person primarily responsible for that was Frederick Taylor. Taylorism is basically his contribution to management theory, and really kicked off the advent of modern management, in which management was no longer just let's see how this works or let's try it, but it was really the idea that every job should be analyzed scientifically to determine the most efficient way to do that. And it led to things like standardization, specialization, and really the advent of mass production, which of course resulted in increased productivity. And of course, there were, I'm not saying that this is the end all be all. Management did not stop there. And I realized that some jobs became very tedious and repetitive. And that's why we did advance in management to much more humane ways of doing things. But really, it was the introduction of data and the analysis of data that came from Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor, he's relying basically on the scientific method, right? The idea that these rule of thumb work methods were based on scientific studies, and he used these to select, train, and develop workers. He used them to provide detailed instructions and to help supervisors with ways that workers could be more productive. They could waste less time, and they could introduce these types of scientific management principles into their performance of tasks. So let's think about, especially as a history major, but really anybody who's interested in data should think about where your data is coming from. Of course, primary data is really access to original data, right? People, in the law, it's people who are actually there, right? People who were involved. It could be raw data sources or original information. But of course, data gets filtered through many other sources and many people, right? And so you get secondary sources in which people introduce their own interpretation. And that's often where you get some sort of reformulation. And of course, you can get biases. And then tertiary sources are basically things that have compiled that data and possibly introduced even more bias in it. I'm pretty sure TikTok falls somewhere down there. Okay, So how do we know what we know? What can we trust? Common sense and intuition. People love to trust their common sense and intuition, and in many cases that can work, but it's also potentially a source of misinformation. And misinformation makes it more difficult to sort truth from fiction. So just wanted to quickly review the scientific method. I know you probably all have seen this from, I know this starts getting introduced in grade school and continues through high school. But I do think there's kind of a distance that's been introduced where people are now separated from some of these concepts, right? So the idea here is that we have an idea that's based on some theory, and we're going to test that against actual data. So we create a hypothesis based on a particular set of theory that exists. And we can do things in which we manipulate certain variables. So we set some variables that we're going to measure, and we set other variables that we can actually change and manipulate, right? Or measure or vary in some way. So these are called independent and dependent variables. So let's say an experiment to determine the effect of employee wages on employee satisfaction, right? You can imagine those two items are correlated. Wages are the independent variable because that's something that you can move up and down, right? And then you would measure the satisfaction based on those wages. Of course, scientific method also relies on the two sort of pillars of reliability and validity. Reliability is, does the thing that you're measuring come out the same way every time you measure it? It doesn't have to be 100%, but the closer you get to 100%, the more reliable something would be, right? A test or a measure. And then validity refers to the degree to which a measure accurately assesses the specific concept that it's supposed to measure. So a test can be reliable without being valid, right? So for instance, you could have a scale at home that measures your weight, but if it's off by 10 pounds, it will be off by 10 pounds every day that it measures you. It's measuring your weight, but it's not reliable. I mean, it is reliable, but it's not valid anymore, right? Because it's not giving you something that you can trust. So a test can be reliable without being valid, gives the same answer every time. But for a test to be valid, first has to be reliable. So once you get some sort of results, you can start looking at things like correlations, right? So we can apply some statistical approaches and some statistical analysis and methods into looking at things like correlations, right? Correlations are how much does one variable vary when the other variable changes. So you guys have all heard about this, right? Correlations they fall between -1 and 1, although they're hardly ever perfectly correlated, right? But the more correlated something is, the more likely that a relationship exists between the two of them. And we'll talk about some of the dangers of that later, but just wanted to kind of review some basic statistical concepts. So there's been a lot of discussion recently, if you've been following the news, about vaccinations, right? You know, how much can we trust vaccination research? Should you be vaccinating yourself? Should you be vaccinating your kids? This, of course, became a really hot topic during COVID when people started saying, well, I'll do my own research. That's great. I'm encouraging you to do your own research, and that's part of what this presentation is about. But you have to figure out how to do that research, because really the gold standard of decision making now is evidence-based decision making. So it's not just trusting your gut and hoping that you're going with the thing that makes the most sense to you, but it's actually looking at the facts and encouraging your organization and the people who work in your organization to be committed to getting the best evidence and then making decisions based on that type of evidence, right? So that you're not just introducing bias or making things up in some cases. Of course, evidence-based decision-making has been incredibly successful in the medical field, right? Where you're making life or death decisions. And we can talk about some of the ways that happens, right? But you're basically looking for, what are the facts that you can trust? So I'm going to give you a hypothetical scenario, and these are two ways that people tend to make decisions, right? So imagine a scenario where, unfortunately, you've been diagnosed with some sort of terminal cancer, right? And you have two choices. I'm going to make these mutually exclusive choices, right? So let's say that you have somebody that you trust, maybe you're, a parent, or somebody, in your community, is a good friend of yours who says, "Hey, I had that same exact type of cancer, and I ate 100 oranges every day, and my cancer went away." That could be strong evidence, right? Especially if it's, all right, well, it's my mother saying that, we're genetically related. She ate 100 oranges a day, and her cancer went away. There's a really good chance that maybe you want to follow that strategy too, right? And then you go to your doctor and they say, "Actually, we think you should not eat any oranges. We think you should just get chemotherapy." Right? Now, I realized, of course, you could do both. But in my hypothetical situation, you have to choose one or the other. Let's say that chemotherapy says you're not allowed to eat any oranges during the chemotherapy, right? Because for some reason there's an allergic reaction to oranges. So I'll often present this in my class, and I'll ask my students, which do you think you would do? And surprisingly, a very large number of them say, "I would eat the oranges." It surprises me. I don't know if it surprises you or not. But I wanted to make the distinction between these two decision-making strategies. One is called clinical decision-making, which sounds medical, right? It's actually it's the less scientific. It's basically just using human judgment and expertise, but it's really like a clinical experience, right? So it's one person, two people who had this experience, but that can carry a lot of weight, right? Especially if it's somebody that you trust, somebody who's decision-making process, somebody who you're close to. The other is called actuarial decision-making, which is structured and statistical. Turns out that the research indicates that actuarial approaches outperform clinical judgments on accuracy. And why is that? Well, it's because it's for several reasons, right? One is sample size, right? If your mother ate a lot of oranges and she got cured of cancer, that is just one person, right? And it's very possible that her cancer would have gone away whether she ate oranges or not, and had nothing to do with the actual oranges. Whereas actuarial decision-making relies on large number of people who have cancer and who follow a strictly controlled particular type of therapy, in this case, chemotherapy, and they will look at those and see, okay, well, hopefully they do a random blind study, right? They put, they separate half the people, they give half the people the medicine, the other half the people no medicines, hopefully some kind of placebo, right? The people administering the drug don't know what drug they're administering. The people who are receiving the drug don't know what they're receiving. So there's less chance of introducing bias. So this really becomes a much more reliable way to make decisions. So in order to look at data and to measure data, we need to use some level of statistics, right? I think that if you get a chance, if you don't have a background in statistics, or even if you do, I definitely encourage you to use this as much as possible. Statistics basically are divided into two large areas, right? So there's descriptive statistics, which summarize data. So if you have a data set, it basically looks at what is going on in that population or sample size that you're measuring, right? So you can think about things like means, medians, modes, the range or variance, standard deviation, basically how common is something. And we can look at some kind of distribution of data. Of course, that's nice to have, right? But really, the power of statistics comes in when you get to inferential statistics, which are predictive. What you're going to do is to use that sample to try to guess, okay, well, if I were in this group of people and I did this thing, or I took this medication, what is the probability that I would be cured, right? And so through statistical methods, like hypothesis testing, like regression, we can actually test data and find out the probability that something will occur or is likely to occur in the future, given whatever sample size you have. So luckily, artificial intelligence has made this a lot easier. And I have been sort of experimenting with using different data sets and AI tools. And it's become very easy. If you can access a data set, then you can actually feed it through an AI processor and come up with these type of statistics very easily on your own. So I will show you the results of some of those. But I wanted to first go into, okay, where might we get these data sets, right? So I don't know if you've heard about, this is the General Social Survey is actually the largest sociological survey in the United States. It's been occurring since 1972, and I believe the last major survey was last year in 2024. At this point, they've collected over 6,000 variables, so 6,000 answers from almost 70,000 participants. And the idea here is to basically monitor the American society over time, right? What are the trends in opinions, attitudes, and behaviors? And luckily, they collect all kinds of demographic information too, right? Things like, obviously, age, sex, race, education level, what's your highest degree attained, what's your income, where do you live, are you married, how many children do you have, what's your religious affiliation, how often do you attend a religious service, where were your parents born, what are your political views, what political party do you belong to, how much do you tend to trust other people, are you happy, how happy are you healthy, how healthy are you, what's your job satisfaction, how much TV do you watch, how much socializing do you do with your relatives, how often do you go out to bars, how often do you socialize with your friends. So really, this is just a small handful of the 6,000 variables that they collect. But you can imagine if you had access to this data set, which you all do because it's 100% free, you can actually download this data and start looking at, what are the relationships between these things. So, it does, education, years of education completed affect your income, right? And when you see all these studies that come out, this is oftentimes where they're getting their data, their information from, and their results. So all kinds of really interesting information. If you're curious, you can just Google General Social Survey, but I've also put the links in here for you. So this comes out of the University of Chicago and their research center there. And it's basically, this is a huge data set. I downloaded it recently, and in Excel, it was over 2 gigabytes. But still, modern computers can handle this kind of stuff, and AI can handle it. And you don't need to necessarily analyze the whole data set at once. You can cut it down and chop it up. So this is one data set which yields some really interesting information. So if you have research projects, then I definitely encourage you to look into this type of data set. The government, of course, was it Reagan who said, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," right? The scariest words in the English language. Actually, the government does have tons of free data still available for the time being. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has all kinds of interesting information. The Census Bureau, which is mandated by law to be conducted every decade at least, collects all kinds of interesting information. The U.S. Department of Commerce does economic analysis, and USDA, the Department of Agriculture, also has really interesting data sets. Another idea, if I don't know if any of you are interested in investing, but if you can gain any kind of insight into the economic data before it hits the general population, you can actually do much better in investing, right? So if you're looking at any kinds of things like what's the unemployment rate, what kind of economic data is happening, for instance, what's the delinquency rate on all loans, right? So if you think the U.S. is headed into recession, you can just look up from the Federal Reserve Bank what are the delinquency rates on all kinds of debt. So mortgages, on consumer debt. You can look up price index, of course. So I've found this a really interesting way of kind of being a little bit ahead of the curve on investing. Of course, there's the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay, I think I went through some of these already. Okay, other places, data.gov also has really interesting data sets. For instance, they have all of the lottery Powerball winning numbers since 2010. So if you think there's any way of figuring out, maybe predicting what the next lottery numbers are going to be, you could actually download all the past lottery winnings from since 2010. I think it's almost up to $2 billion now, right? The latest Powerball. So if you win, you have to share it with everybody in this room.
I think it's 1.7 they're estimating.
1.7. Oh, well, I don't play until it gets to 2 billion, so.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, all right. We have other things. Our data, our world in data. The World Bank has all kinds of great information, especially from for other countries, right? Like what percentage of the world has access to electricity. There is another thing called the Urban Data Catalog, which talks about the different types of debt that Americans hold. Kaggle is a huge repository of published data models, and they even run some competitions, right? So they had a data model of people who were on the Titanic and what their demographic information was. So like not just what cabin they were in, but what their background was, how much money they had, things like that, and how likely were they to survive the Titanic sinking, right? And so you can take information like this and figure out, okay, well, were rich people more likely to survive, so that you can figure out what, maybe make some predictions or have some hypothesis about what your income had to do with your likelihood of surviving the Titanic. Raw data is often available from unexpected sources. So if you're interested in the housing market, Zillow and Redfin both publish data. They both publish a lot of the data that they collect. You can imagine they have tons of data in terms of housing trends. They record all housing sales. You can look at the delta difference between what sellers asked versus what buyers actually got the house for. So you can see that difference. And you can imagine this could be a really good tool in terms of predicting where housing prices are going, right? If people are overbidding or underbidding on houses, and if they're actually getting that, securing that house. IMDb, if you're interested in movies, publishes all kinds of data sets in terms of ratings. Netflix used to publish a lot more data. They've gotten a little bit more stingy in their public data, but sometimes you can email them and tell them that you're a researcher, and they'll give you their data sets, or they might be available on other websites like Kaggle. I don't know if you guys remember, but Netflix actually had a competition out there a few years ago, and so they made their data sets available, and they were looking for anybody who could create an algorithm that would be more accurate in predicting who was likely to rate a movie higher or lower, and then what was the next movie they were likely to watch, so they could use predictive analytics to propose future movies to them, things that would hook them in. Amazon, of course, Amazon being another private company, they're not willing to share a lot of their own Of course, they're not going to share proprietary information about customers, but they do have something called the Amazon Registry of Open Data because they control large amounts of cloud computing space and people upload a lot of data there. And so they have all kinds of interesting data sets online too. So that's another great source of information. Okay. And I just want to, after giving you all of that information, I want to warn you that with great power comes great responsibility, which is from Spider-Man. But Mark Twain or possibly Benjamin Disraeli, we're not sure who said this. There are three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. Of course, statistics can be twisted in many ways. And again, I think this comes back to the point about misinformation versus disinformation. What is the intent of your statistics? Of course, you can use statistics in malicious ways to try to fool people, but I think much more likely is the fact that statistics can be a little bit complicated and people make honest mistakes. What are some of the honest mistakes that tend to happen? Well, there was a study recently that said that people who own horses are healthier. So if I read that and I believed it, I would go out and buy a horse, right? Because I would be more likely to be healthy. What is the fallacy in that correlation? Quick, go buy a horse. No, because correlation is not causation, right? That you cannot necessarily go out and buy a horse, and it isn't because you go out and buy a horse that you become healthy. It's because who tends to own horses? Rich people, right? So if you're rich, you probably have access to really good health care, and you probably eat really well because you're educated and you have access to, natural foods and fruit and vegetables and things like that. So things that seem obvious on the surface, like people who own horses are healthier, it's not always obvious that it's because of that, but it's really just a high correlation. We get into problems with correlation because causation is incredibly difficult to actually demonstrate, right? So correlation cannot show causation in any way, really. You really need a randomized control, which is difficult to get, right? Because if you have something like smoking, right, we actually cannot demonstrate that smoking causes cancer because we cannot create a randomized controlled trial. It's not ethical to say, okay, we're going to force these 100 people to smoke for the next year, and these people are not allowed to smoke for the next year. And so because you can't randomly assign the independent variable, in this case, we can't ever actually prove that smoking causes cancer, but when you get into really high correlations, you can make a causal inference, which is much more likely. Laboratory tests, you can often do randomized controlled trial in medical settings, and really that's what's required. You have to be leery of correlations and causations, which happen all the time. This is another thing I saw online. Children who know 2 languages score 34% higher on problem-solving tests by 4. Bilingual brains aren't confused. They're supercharged for sharper thinking and creativity. Here's why bilingual kids have the best edge over their peers, right? And so you might think to yourself, well, quick, let's get my kid into the second language class, right? But, again, this is a correlation causation fallacy. Chances are kids who know more than one language come from, more cosmopolitan families, tend to have access to higher levels of education, tend to be wealthier, right? And so it's not that you're forcing your kid to learn a second language, but it's really that they have exposure to a better educational system. There's another famous study, which I wasn't sure if this was real or not, but I did some research. This is actually a real statistical study that was done by Abraham Wald after World War II. He was part of the statistical research group at Columbia University, and he was charged with figuring out and helping aircraft mechanics make the bombers more likely to survive an attack. And so they started analyzing the planes and where they got shot up, right? And then they said, okay, well, this is where planes are more likely to be shot at. And so let's put on some extra armor in the areas where bullets are more likely to hit. And of course, this is the fallacy of survivorship bias, because what they didn't realize is that the planes that made it back with all those holes in them are the ones that survived because they weren't shot in the vital areas, right? And so they were patching the wrong areas of the plane. They were reinforcing the wings and the tips instead of reinforcing the areas around the fuel tanks and the engines. So this statistical fallacy occurs in real life. Here's a study I read recently that said CEOs over 70 outperformed the S&P index by 2.5 times in 5 years. Seems like a reasonable conclusion, right? But we have to ask ourselves, what happened to the younger CEOs who underperformed? Well, they never made it to be 70-year-old CEOs, right? So there's a survivorship bias that's happening in this study where only the older CEOs who performed well tended to be measured in the study. And then this is one that always kind of makes me laugh a little bit. So you might think that one of the problems of some studies is that they don't have a large enough sample size. And that can be a problem, right? If your sample size is 6 people, it's hard to reach any kind of logical statistical conclusions, right? There's a well-known study by the Dave Ramsey Financial Group, and he touts this on his program all the time, where he interviewed over 10,000 US millionaires, and he looked for the traits that tended to be associated with accumulating more money, right? And so you would think, well, 10,000 millionaires, if you look at their behaviors and their traits, you must be able to conclude something, right? But the problem is that he's leaving out a whole group of people. So he has no comparison group. This statistical fallacy is called sampling on the dependent variable. And the idea here is that you cannot make any conclusions if you're only looking at one group. So say, for instance, in this study, he found that the vast majority of millionaires woke up super early, right? Say before, 5 a.m. And then you might conclude, well, if you want to be successful in life and you want to become a millionaire, you should wake up before 5 a.m., right? The problem is, guess who else wakes up before 5 a.m.? Homeless people, right? You know why? Because that's when traffic starts, right? So if you're living under a bridge or on the side of a freeway, you tend to wake up very early in the morning so that you can move to someplace safer or someplace quieter, right? So it's not really a valid comparison if you're only looking at one group of people, because the other group of people might be doing exactly the same thing. And so there's a lot of this kind of statistical mistakes that occur even in very well-known and very well-researched areas. So that's just a word of warning. Okay, so I encourage you to do your own research. Be very leery of any kind of research studies or statements, especially on TikTok. And go to the original data source if you can, right? We are living in the era of information. Unfortunately, that means we're also living in the era of misinformation. But it's really easy to get to data these days and to look things up. So I'm wondering if you have any questions or if there's any particular data sources that you've come across recently that you'd like to share with everyone.